Yeah, so and then the other thing too that I kind of actually want to talk about going off of this as well real quick before we move on, which is actually something a question of a greater, not not talking about her or using the situation lightly, but something I just thought was interesting that I want to mention that I saw kind of a hot take on, and it was about this in general in a different sense from looking at it as, do players really need press conferences like they used to? And the reason why I saw this was a thing is because, and I kind of get it, is that back in the day, press conferences used to be a thing where, because you didn't have social media to get your name out there, because of all that, you were able, like fans and people were able to get to know you and your personality based on post press conferences, and you're talking to the media and talking to the public in that way. And so it's one of those where it brings up a kind of an interesting question, that kind of isn't related but related, is whether or not athletes really need the press conference or post game press conference anymore as much as the networks and sports places need it for revenue and things like that. And it was citing things like, for example, like Kyrie Irving, been doesn't like doing press conferences or whatever, and they were saying like, well, does Kyrie Irving really need the press conference to answer the same questions he does all the time, or anything, if he can just get his own like popularity and stuff based on social media? And that goes the same for most athletes, where they can interact with their fans and their fans can see their personality and get to know them better on social media. So it's one of those where, do we actually really, like, do players really need to value the press conference as well as they used to? Which was just an interesting idea that I thought was kind of fun to poke at and see if what you thought about that and talk about it.
So is the question, do the players themselves for their own benefit need press conferences? Or as a whole, the sport or the team? Because
Like
then
it
that's
was,
different.
yeah, it was basically saying like, with players not needing it as much anymore for popularity, ego gaining, usually that's when people, like I said, back before social media and everything,
Right.
would kind of interact with the player and kind of get to know their personality. The question kind of is, with that being said, does the sports world really need post game press conferences anymore? Especially because there's always controversy with them, where you always see things where it's like, some reporter asks a dumb question like, well, why didn't you shoot well? And then the person goes like, what do you want me to say? Like, I didn't do well. What do you want me to say? And like gets angry. And then
Yeah.
it's just a pointless press conference. Like, the things like that always pop up, where it's like the reporters just start asking dumb stuff or something happens. And the question is basically, do we need those in sports anymore? Or is it one of those where we can all just kind of like, maybe a weekly press conference is good enough and let's call it a day?
I'll say, unfortunately, like I think it's like in terms of personal growth, and if like players want to brand themselves and get themselves in recognition, like, certainly not. They don't need that at all. In terms of like keeping the sport fresh in everybody's minds and giving people to talk about and giving the 24/7 news cycle with almost every sport now, like yeah, they definitely need it, because those clips you're talking about where people get mad at like stupid questions, those are what like circulate on Twitter. People have effects on that. You got your one, like, your cousin Andy or whatever saying like, why did he have to react like that? And then you got like Uncle George being like, well, he's just asking a question. And then that generates news cycles. That's a hashtag that gets like more exposure to the sport, that forms an opinion about the player and then why people like them, they hate it, all like fosters engagement, and they love that. Like there's so much stuff on that because there's so many things you could do with that, and networks or YouTube or literally what we're doing right now to talk about. It literally keeps it fresh in people's minds, and that's what's annoying about it. It's like when you hate a commercial and you hear it all the time, and even though you hate it so much, it's like stuck in your head and you're like, I'll never buy that product. That's how I am with most things. It still takes that part of your brain every time you see something related to it, and it forces that connection, when you're seeing things like that. And it just takes parts of your vision in like things you're paying attention to. It always takes up space. So for the business and like the sports franchise or sports entity as itself, like yeah, they definitely need. They love that. They would have more of it if they could. That's why you see there's so much around like the OTAs, maybe like for the NFL or any practices, G League practices. Um, I mean, even if it's outside of sports conferences, I guess you can make an argument that like players having their own social media on the side, like having their own videos and stuff, and like recording things at practices. I mean, those get fostered around pretty well too, but or like thrown around. But I don't know if they're also you can't enforce it. You can't like regulate it and have it once a week like you're talking about, or maybe even more than that. It's just kind of relying on players to be expressive on their own, which in a lot of cases, I think we talked about this before, like with the MLB or the NHL. If you don't have that sort of thing and give those players like opportunities to express themselves and kind of force them to, they don't have superstars to market. They don't have other people to throw into the national spotlight and write stories about. So I think it kind of forces it, and they do the best they can with that. And you get lots of different scenarios where people don't. They just have the same answers. The people who slip into the background and you don't hear a lot about, they give you the media answer, they give you the PR answer, boom, they're done, they're out of there. Everyone's happy, they're done with it, and the press gets something that they can clip into, dot, 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 they said, blah, dot, 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 they'll retire, or whatever else it might be. So yeah, it depends on who you're talking about, I guess, and the stakeholders in it. But I think in terms of like sports media, it needs it desperately for lots of different reasons, especially if we're talking about in the season, especially off season, I guess. It could be important. But yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of what you said. I mean, it is true that obviously those clips and stuff like that, kind of make the sport, and you get those like sound bites that, everybody then uses for the next week on the show before the next content comes. And if you're like a fan of one sport, for instance, and, in the bye week or in the week where, for example, the NFL, how it occurs on basically Sunday and Monday night, all that. And it's like during the week, people are looking for news and stuff to talk about. And so then they start talking about those sound bites. And those are great ways for, like you said, people to make memes or, form opinions about people, or, kind of bring, conversation to a topic that maybe wouldn't get talked about before. I mean, like, for instance, what we're talking about right now with this whole segment, about Naomi, Osaka, not going to press conferences. I just think it's interesting to think about whether or not it matters for the players and whether or not they'll actually really fight for press conferences or post-game press conferences more specifically, because press conferences in general are a thing that I think obviously the sports world needs, but I think it's more about post-game press conferences as far as like immediately after the game. Players hate talking to the media immediately after the game. Sometimes, if you've won, you want to celebrate. If you lost, you want to move on to the next game, that kind of thing. And answering questions about your play and stuff like that when that you didn't play well, or it always gets people angry, and players hate it. So it's one of those where I almost wonder if players will ever put their foot down with this, and this will be continuing to be a thing where we'll start to see players refuse more and more to do post-game press conferences just because of all of that. I mean, how many times in the post-game press conference can we ask Aaron Rodgers if he likes Jordan Love, or it's like it's things like that where you just go like, this, how many times can we do this before like it starts to get too redundant where players are just like, listen, I don't want to be here. This is, people aren't watching this over and over again, like for this, same question to be asked and me to say the same thing. So I think there's something to be said there. But yeah, it's just an interesting commentary I saw on the topic, and kind of something that came out of this about players' power and, individual athletes' power in their own sports media, and just, their own sport in general, and being able to kind of flex that a little bit in post-game press conferences does make sense if that is a thing going forward. So yeah, so it's just, like I said, just a fun topic that I kind of wanted to cover that I thought was interesting. I saw it proposed basically in a couple of articles, and that's what kind of sparked me to kind of, I don't know, think about that, or like see that and be like, oh, that would be kind of a fun topic, get our opinions on, as well as maybe get some comments from viewers and stuff. But yeah, so just something I thought would be interesting to bring up and